Who is wise and understanding among us? It's not always the ones we would expect, is it? Not always the ones we would jump to think about first, and certainly not always the ones who seem to think it of themselves. Have you heard the somewhat improbable joke about a small plane trip with there's only 3 people on the plane? There's the pilot, there's a Boy Scout, and there's Elon Musk. What a combination. I can't even imagine, except for setting up a joke, how those 3 people could get on a plane. But anyway, they're going somewhere, and the plane's engine fails. Uh-oh. Nothing on God's green earth, or for that matter in God's blue sky, will get it to start again. And so the pilot turns to his passengers and he says, well, it's a small plane. We can glide for a little while. I can try to get us to a flat area, but we are going down. And unfortunately, we've got only 2 parachutes. I suggest we draw straws. Well, before he can even finish his sentence and get the word straws out, Elon Musk has grabbed a pack and is starting to fumble with the door so he can get out. And he says, now you 2 can fight over that other one if you want to, but I'm the smartest man in the world and I'm needed. And so he jumps out the door with the pack on his back. The pilot and the Boy Scout are staring at each other, and the pilot is turning pale. The Boy Scout has a big grin on his face. Son, what are you smiling about? Says the pilot. I guess you think maybe I should go down with the plane, like the captain of the ship. I guess you think that other parachute belongs to you. No, sir, says the scout, not to worry. What do you mean not to worry, says the pilot. We had 2 chutes, now there's only 1, and this plane is going down. No, sir, says the scout again, not to worry, there's still 2 chutes, because the smartest man in the world just jumped out of this plane holding my backpack. Who indeed is wise among us? James paints us a sort of portrait of that person, doesn't he? Although we might call it a kind of impressionistic painting, because while the details are hazy, the overall picture comes out pretty clearly. He begins by mentioning good works, which is one of the main themes of his whole epistle. James is on about good works all the time. And we have to balance that with the rest of the New Testament, where it's clear that it is grace that saves us and not our good works. But what James wants to emphasize over and over again is that if your faith doesn't lead you to do good works, then you just don't get it. What he adds here is that the person who is wise will perform those good deeds in meekness. The wise person is not jealous or selfish or even ambitious. Those things are earthly and unspiritual. He even says devilish. Rather, one who is wise is pure and peaceable and gentle, open to reason, merciful, without uncertainty or insincerity. The picture that I get from him is of someone who goes around quietly and confidently doing the right thing, or at least trying to do the right thing, without drawing attention to him or herself, but rather encouraging others to turn their attention to God, who inspired the good works in the first place. So one doesn't have to be old to be wise. You don't have to have read a lot of books. You don't need a high IQ. It's much simpler and much more complex than that. I think at its root, wisdom has to do with letting God have charge of every aspect of human life. And most of us probably aren't at the point yet where we're real good at that. Or maybe I'm the only one, but I doubt it. Or perhaps it might be more accurate to say that for each of us, there are certain aspects where we absolutely do let God be in charge. Certain areas where we welcome God's guidance, maybe even God's control. and that also for each of us, there are other aspects of our lives where we're kind of uncomfortable letting God in, and we don't really want to know what God thinks about it, and we really kind of wish God would leave us alone about those particular subjects. Thank you very much. But let's start with something simple. We're pretty good at letting God have a say over matters that are obviously religious. Most church members try to be peaceable and merciful and sincere toward one another. When we do disagree, and it does happen, but when we disagree, we listen to each other. We're open to reason. We're open to having our minds changed. Even if we think it's probably unlikely, we still listen. It's not much of a problem to let God have charge of us when we are in this place, when we are with these people. And I would guess that most of us try very hard to be wise when it comes to ordering our family relationships, yeah? That's not always easy. I mean, sharing living space with other people is always going to involve compromising on things. And we're occasionally going to step on each other's toes, literally or figuratively. And it can be hard to be peaceable and gentle if you have a 2-year-old in the house, or a teenager in the house, or if you are the teenager in the house and you have to put up with your parents who just don't get it. It's hard to be merciful when your spouse has left their dirty socks in the middle of the floor for the 132,000th time, or ran up the Visa card a little higher than they should have this past month. We don't always live up to the ideal of wisdom in our families, but most of us would agree that it's something we want to aim for. We would like for God to be in charge of our family relationships. But beyond the church and the family, I think there's a lot less agreement. It's a lot more difficult. I mean, for each of us, as I say, there are some aspects of human life where we're happy to let God in and mess with it and wish everybody else would listen to God more carefully. And others where we really wish God would leave us the heck alone. Areas where we think maybe God doesn't belong or doesn't have anything useful to say. Yeah. For some of us, that may be our work life or our life if we own our own business, the running of a business. How can God ask us to be meek and merciful when we have to strive to get ahead, even to get noticed? How can you not be a little bit boastful if you have to advertise your business so that people will come in? How can we be peaceful when we have to fight our competitors? How can I be sincere when my boss always expects me to agree with her? How can I remain open to reason with customers who are unreasonable? For many of us, our life in the world of work ends up getting shut away from our life with God. That each has its own little compartment, and each one is very important to us, but in so many ways they seem irreconcilable. And so we keep our distance from the wisdom of God because we can't see how the pieces fit. For others of us, it may be hard to think about letting God into the big picture of world affairs and national affairs, of politics and economics, of war and peace. How's it be possible to be peaceable, we ask, when there are crazy people like Vladimir Putin on the planet? You can't possibly be entirely sincere if you want to conduct diplomacy successfully. We can't be gentle, can we, when there are violent criminals in our streets? Have you ever seen a meek person elected to public office? I mean, many of us have a hard time envisioning where God fits into the ordering of public life. Maybe our city council or school board or even Congress open a meeting with prayer, but not often does God get taken seriously in any of the discussions that follow. Whenever we remark that The church shouldn't get involved in or make statements about government or economics or war or peace or foreign policy or domestic policy. It's the same thing as saying that God has no business in those aspects of life. And that moves us away from wisdom. On the other hand, there are those of us who may want for God to be active in and to reach down and fix the larger messes of our public life, but who wish that God would leave alone our private lives. After all, we reason, unless my actions actively hurt somebody else, what business is that of God's? Why should God have any say over how I spend my time and my money? Does God care if I drink too much as long as I don't go out and drive and hurt somebody? Does God care if I sleep around as long as I don't exploit people or pass along some terrible disease? Is it any business of God's if I go buy a whole closet full of new clothes, never mind that the old ones fit just fine? Those are last year's. Any time that we want to put our personal life in a box, separate from God's oversight, God's influence, then we're keeping our distance from wisdom. Who among us is wise? Well, we're all working on it. We wouldn't be here on a Sunday morning when we could be sleeping in if we weren't interested in working on it. But if we're really interested in having wisdom and understanding, we need to let God out of the boxes that we put God in, out of the limits we've constructed or the walls we've drawn around various parts of our lives, and let God in to church and family and work, public and private. We need to be whole, not fragmented, not compartmentalized. We need to learn how to be peaceable and gentle and merciful and sincere and all that wonderful, scary stuff that God calls us to be. We need to learn from Jesus Christ, who was all of those things, and yes, who suffered for it, but who triumphed. We need to trust God and each other because the journey to wisdom cannot be made in isolation. It just doesn't work. Who is wise? God is, and we're trying. May God give us the grace and the strength to stay on that path. Amen.